Wairimu Nderitu, an analyst who has worked on armed conflict and mediation, says when women are involved, better results are achieved. She has been part of peace talks in many countries, including Nigeria, Sudan and Kenya. Nderitu says while women are victims rather than perpetrators of the wars, they are still excluded from resolutions and peace talks. She shares her thoughts on what she calls the war economy.
As a mediator of armed conflict, I don't carry the typical face of a mediator of armed conflict. In this continent and in many parts of the world, of course, men have always been at the forefront of leading peace mediation with armed groups. And women also are expected to be older, like people talk about grandmother's wisdom. So they expect women to be older, that they do not expect women like me to be doing these kind of things. And often you hear people saying, like the current, right now there's a lot of capacity building going on for women to become mediators. And sometimes you hear the argument that no, we don't need all this capacity building for women to become mediators because who trained, for example, Kofi Annan? Who trained, for example, President Obasanjo, so that they can be doing those kind of things? But what people do not know is, for example, when Dr. Kofi Annan came to Kenya to mediate, he was the face everybody was seeing. But behind him, we were there. We were the people with expertise. And we are the people with, and mediation is something that you actually have to build capacity for. You can imagine how delicate it is, how many lives we affect through our mediation. And people assume that just anyone can come and do it. As if you can be a doctor without any training as a doctor or a lawyer. And then conversely, you will always find in communities that people accept women who are judges, women as lawyers, women as presidents. But when it comes to mediating armed conflict, people want to see a man. It's always assumed in many places that men, since they lead peace processes, men, since they lead, in many cases, war, in the creation of war, that therefore it's automatic that they should be leading in peace processes. It doesn't work like that. The professional skills and, of course, political will and extreme support from male allies have helped women like me, because we've been mediating for many years, long before it became fashionable to do so, long before we even heard of women, peace and security. And I remember, for example, meeting with Stella Sabiti, who is here, Mama Stella, in Washington, D.C. in 2009. We were had been selected like among, in the world, the 21 foremost women mediators of armed conflict. And at that particular time, that was long ago, before people even knew about this kind of thing. So I have a human rights background. And I'll get to the issue of war and peace economies. I'm laying the foundation now when I speak about I have a human rights background. And I used to work in human rights, I still do. And, but it became increasingly difficult for me when working with communities in conflict to be able to translate human rights principles into real life. Because you see, it's one thing to declare the right to water, but another thing to provide it. It was one thing for me when I worked here in this country, in Rwanda, speaking at the Rwandan Military Academy, in, then called Ruhengeri, now called Musanzi, speaking and telling military officers that, you know, a convention against genocide has existed since 1948. And then they ask, so whose human rights does it protect? We had a genocide in 1994. So it became very important for me to keep asking questions in terms of what next? So I know about rights. I'm talking to communities about rights. In Kenya at that particular time, we didn't even have a new constitution with any human rights in it. So you're talking about UN conventions and declarations that haven't been domesticated in law, and people are wondering, what is she talking about? So anyway, so that I got into peace building, into conflict prevention as an answer to that human rights. What next? So initially I began working on dialogue facilitation with communities. In Kenya, the Kenya-Somali border, Kenya-Ethiopia border, then got into Somalia, got into Ethiopia. And then when we had the crisis in Kenya in 2008, I was then working for the National Commission on Human Rights. And at that time, Jerry Kinyoho, who is here, now working for the ADN Bank, she used to fund us from ActionAid. And we were very, very, very active commission. And we kept telling people, there is going to be violence in 2008. There is going to be violence. We could see all the indicators, but nobody was listening to us. And increasingly, I kept asking myself, what do you do if you're working for human rights and nobody's listening to you? What further do you need to do? So then my getting into conflict prevention and peace building became very, very solid at that point. And then I got on board one of the commissions that was created by Dr. Kofi Annan to implement the peace agreement that he brokered with Dr. Graça Machel and President Mkapa. So then, working in that commission, 4 years of doing nothing except running around the country, getting communities to sign social contracts, getting communities to speak to each other, getting communities to understand how to share this market, how to share this water source, how to hold the fabric of a country together for 4 years, leading us up to the next election, became my core work. And I was very, very, very committed. I've written a book about it, like about what we did in those 4 years. So anyway, after that, then I moved to Nigeria, initially to Plateau State to help women to get on board a peace process. So I moved as a gender advisor. And then the colleague I was working with, who was heading the peace process, after we finished the JOS process, unfortunately fell sick. He later passed on. He was Nigerian, and I was asked to take over as a lead mediator. So I had the experience of mediating from Nakuru that Professor Karaja mentioned. And in Nakuru, we'd had a peace process during those years of violence in Kenya, where we sat with members, because we did a conflict analysis of the whole country and established that at that particular time, only the Rift Valley had the potential to make the whole country fall apart. So we looked for the key people in the Rift Valley, and we ended up in a room with 100 male elders, 3 mediators, 2 male and me. And for 18 months, we sat with those communities. For 18 months, I was the only woman in that room. And I was the only mediator who attended all the sessions. And when then I moved to Nigeria, now to help women to get on board on the peace process, I actually had the experience of being the woman in the room and now going to Nigeria and seeing all these women who are outside the peace process and trying to get them on board. And Nigerian women, you know, are very strong. And we devised so many strategies. And we were able to get women on board in so many levels. As negotiators, we had a steering committee on the side that was evaluating whatever was coming out of the room. We had processes going on the ground, speaking with women. We had so many things going on. So anyway, I then moved to Kaduna State now when my colleague got sick, and I became the lead mediator, which was very, very tough, because in Jos, we were working with 8 ethnic communities. In Kaduna, we sat in Kafanchan with 29 ethnic communities. I was the lead mediator. We went through this process for close to 2 years, just speaking. The issues in Kaduna are very deep, incredibly deep. And it's been one of the most, it's a peace process that keeps me awake even now. I wake up at night thinking about it, because the violence kept recurring. The people we started the peace process with, so many of them died as a result of the violence that kept continuing. And we ended up with the peace process. Then I moved to Plateau State, and as we continued implementing in Kaduna. And then Plateau State then became the place where, like, it really was. And it was on demand, like the governor of Plateau invited us over, as the governor of Kaduna had invited us. And I was again lead mediator, this time 56 ethnic communities. And I don't know whether you can imagine how big that sounds, because we didn't have all the 56 or the 29 ethnic communities in the room at the same time, except for ceremonies like the opening ceremony or the signing of the roadmap ceremony. But that ceremony, the Plateau, Southern Plateau was so huge, we used to hold it in a football stadium. It was really, really huge. So what lessons have I taken away from this? How does, for example, a war economy look like? So a war economy, in many cases, has the presence of foreign troops on the ground, foreign troops that do not go away. It has expensive peace processes going on and on and on that never end. And you see a lot of public finances and other resources assigned, that could be assigned to education and health, assigned to, for example, the military expenses. We see a culture of failed peace agreements. And then we see that Madame Graça Machel had spoken about how usually that when you have a gun, that qualifies for you a place at the peace table. That if you do not have a gun, then it means you have no constituency to speak of. So who are you speaking for at the peace table? And that's the way we've structured our peace tables. So you see lots of those people with guns sitting at peace tables, but people who sit at peace tables, and I've sat with several of them, who do not admit to individual guilt. They come at the peace table and they talk about other people. They say they're speaking for themselves, for families, for ethnic communities. They do not talk about individual guilt. And then we have the non-recognition among so many of us who keep working in peace processes in so many countries, that experts do not necessarily translate to a good peace process. We fail to see that peace processes can provide financial output for some people, that actually peace can become an industry. We fail to see that peace processes can be curriculum, CV enhancing processes. And we fail to question, for example, people who say that they are experts. And for me, I'm always very wary of experts. If somebody comes to a peace process and says, I'm an expert on the Great Lakes region, especially if you don't come from the Great Lakes, I sit back and marvel, because I say to myself, you come to a place where you do not belong, or where you have come to help, you have some knowledge, and then you become an expert. You've been there 1 year, 2 years, you are an expert. You go to Somalia today, you find people who are born and brought up in Somalia. None of them calls themselves an expert on Somalia. How do you become an expert on the Great Lakes? So the minute you get that expert, and the minute we get ourselves as we have those mindsets as Africans especially, that solutions will come from outside. So we see people coming in and they are experts, and we say, aha, this is it, this is the expert. So that's a system of, that's part of a war economy. That the fact that somebody earns their living from hopping from one war economy to the other one, drafting peace agreements, drafting from this place to the other, that's a war economy. And they are part of the war economy. And you look at, for example, there are all these statistics on failed peace agreements. And I did my master's on peace agreements in the DRC. And also I've myself drafted quite a number of peace agreements and done so much research on peace agreements. And you see all these theoretical phrases, and then you find them in another place. Then you see so much cut and paste. So you're thinking to yourself, who are these people who are moving from one place to the other, cut and pasting, peace agreements, yeah? War economy. Then you look at places where we fight against memory. We don't want to talk about memory. In Kenya, we have everybody who becomes an elected member of anything. The first thing they do is, we are going to Rwanda. We are going to Rwanda. Like, they come here to see the memory, how Rwandan people have put together their memory. You go to South Africa, you go to the Apartheid Museum. You go to all these places that show you, this is what we did and we will never go back there. Why do we resist memory? If you go to a place with a war economy, you will not find memories anywhere. You will not find museums anywhere. You will find, because people do not want to remember what has gone before. And then we find quite a lot of disconnection, again, from the drafters, with politics of big men, completely disconnected with the realities on the ground. Often you ask people on the ground, and also it also helps when you are gauging the perspectives of men and women. You ask people in peace processes, like I usually ask, okay, what does peace look like to you? And then people the men will say things like, peace looks like when the roads are open and our cars can move. It looks like when our businesses can operate. I can open my shop. Then women are saying, peace looks for me like when schools are open and the children are not at home every day asking me, Mom, what's going on? It looks like going to the dispensary and you find medicine there, because nothing is stopping the medicine from getting there. So in terms of war economy, You will see people investing in war chests that do not go to that medicine and food, medicine and of course food and education that the people are talking about. They are looking at putting money into security. And you will see that nobody is talking about the care of veterans. What happens to all these people who are disabled in wars? Nobody is talking about that. So then, as I summarize now, as I end, what then does the converse look like? When you're looking at looking at a peace economy, you're looking at an economy that has accepted that inclusion of women outweighs the risks of outweighs the risks in any peace process. You always find people telling you, if you bring in the women, there'll be a problem because these are the people causing the violence. So when you bring in the women, and traditionally men, and that's what they were saying in Nakuru, because we kept trying to bring in the women. Nakuru in my country, Kenya, they were saying, no, you can't have, women because there are things men can only agree amongst themselves. But in peace economies, they have accepted that inclusion of women outweighs those risks that people put out to you. And then in peace economies, you find education systems that produce Africans and not ethnic nationalists. That sounds like a very heavy statement, but this is what I mean, yeah? See, like my friend Leonie, who's sitting here. Leonie Abela, she was born in Uganda. She grew up in DRC. And then she got married to a Rwandan, who is actually a survivor of the genocide. She has lived in Kenya for the last 22 years. And her husband works in Arusha. So, you look at her and you see real pluralism. And you see and you think about how much energy we invest in our small spaces in being Kikuyu or being Luo or being Baganda or being small things of being Hausa or all these things we invest in, and think about look at the value, because Leonie is one of the the most well-known peace builders in Kenya. She has brokered herself. She's a mediator. She has peace agreements in Kenya. What are we losing by seeing ourselves in terms of small ethnic communities? A peace economy is the one that allows people like Leonie to thrive in DRC, in Rwanda, in Kenya, in Uganda. So, and then you look at an education system that brings in that kind of worldview that we are talking about, identity and values. And remember that education can be used negatively, because in apartheid, South Africa, education was used negatively. It was put in place. And again, as part of my experiences, I was in South Africa. I was in South Africa for 2 years as part of a Commonwealth scholarship. We were working to evaluate the apartheid laws. And yes, I'm ending up. And I think important also to look at places where the peace economies are strong, like Ghana, and think that we are looking at it in terms of, Ghana had a peaceful election, Ghana had another peaceful election. But we are not looking at the investment that was done by the Nkrumah government, for example, in terms of ensuring that the education system, the boarding school system. So today you go to Ghana, you find people mobilizing on the basis of schools. People don't say, this is my ethnic community. People say, this is the school I went to, and the school, you mobilize around the school.